Hi everyone, I'm Runhua, a PhD candidate at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. On behalf of my co-authors, I'm very happy to present a critical computing work from the Chinese context, which is about how LLMs entered digital feminism on Chinese social media and what opportunities and risks this creates for women's empowerment. When we talk about digital feminism, many people think of movements like Me Too. In that framing, social media is often seen as a political space for public voice, collective critique, and institutional pressure. But that picture does not fully explain the Chinese context. In China, because of censorship and the stigma around feminism, feminist expression often appears in a more cautious form. Prior work describes this as everyday feminism, less about overt political claims and more about discussing women's everyday struggles, choices, and dilemmas. Among different platforms, Xiaohongshu, also known as Red Note, with a user base that is around 70% female, has become a key site of everyday feminism in China. On the platform, women's growth is a major topic, covering a large number of discussions such as how to become more capable, more independent, or how to live better. Recently, we noticed that these discussions were no longer only happening among Chinese women themselves. DeepSeek's responses about women's growth had started entering these conversations. For example, women ask questions like, how can girls raise themselves to thrive? Or how can women avoid feeling that life has been in vain? They then shared screenshots of DeepSeek's responses, and many of these posts received substantial engagement. So what we observed was not just private conversations with LLM, but the LLM-generated discourse circulating inside an everyday feminist space. This matters because LLMs are already known to carry gendered assumptions. To investigate these concerns, first, we want to know how women's growth was framed in the DeepSeek responses shared on RedNote. Second, how did the RedNote community receive and evaluate those responses? For the first inquiry, we conducted feminist critical discourse analysis on more than 100,000 Chinese characters of DeepSeek responses shared on RedNote. We drew on Kabir's framework of resources, agency, and achievements to unpack the logic of women's growth inside the shared responses. First, let's see how DeepSeek imagines the goals women should pursue. We see from the figure that it covered multiple life domains, but as covered by the orange color, the dominant logic was to encourage women to adapt to prevailing expectations. For example, in career and work, it emphasized being highly competitive, but rarely mentioned goals like leadership or political authority. In social relations, it encouraged building useful connections, framing relationships more in terms of utility than solidarity or care. At the same time, as shown in green, only a smaller portion of DeepSeek's responses encouraged women to pursue power and rights. For example, some advice warned women to be wary of social scripting, and some encouraged women to recognize workplace gender discrimination and move from rule adapters to rule makers. According to the framework, we further examined how resources and agency were articulated in DeepSeek responses to achieve goals and identified 3 pathways. The first pathway was self-optimization. As indicated by the yellow area, it was dominant. Here, women were encouraged to achieve their goals by doing more, preparing more, and regulating themselves more. For example, DeepSeek advised women to develop hard skills, gain certifications, and manage their careers strategically. It also framed economic independence through self-discipline, such as taking on side hustles instead of resting on weekends. The second pathway is what we call strategic resistance. It was the least frequent pattern, as shown in blue. Here, DeepSeek did acknowledge unequal structures and offered more realistic ways for women to respond. For example, it encouraged women to study feminist theory so that structural problems would not be taken as personal fate. It also suggested finding allies, documenting discrimination, and using legal procedures to defend one's rights in the workplace. The last pathway was named as the direct challenge. It's also rare, as shown in the green. In these responses, DeepSeek more openly encouraged women to reject conventional gender norms and imagine alternative lives. For example, it suggested not being confined by marriage or childbirth, and presented options such as overseas study or entrepreneurship as ways to restart life. But it often ignored the material costs and risks required to make these choices possible. In some cases, the suggestions even became surreal, risky, or disturbing. For example, in the name of rejecting beauty standards imposed on women, DeepSeek suggested that women should replace face slimming injections in beauty salons with ink. Overall, we see that DeepSeek largely encouraged women to pursue growth within existing structures, emphasizing self-optimization. Then let's see how the RedNote community responded to these shared responses. For this, we conducted content analysis of 430 posts and over 3,000 first-layer comments. What stood out was that DeepSeek's advice was largely welcomed and legitimized. Many comments described it as heartwarming, practical, or emotionally resonant. So for many women, these responses did not feel alien or inappropriate. They felt helpful. There was also negotiation and resistance, but it was less common. Some users questioned whether the advice was too demanding, too vague, or too performative. So this created a tension in our findings. The responses often narrowed empowerment into self-optimization, yet they were still broadly embraced. One reason is that DeepSeek made some very real aspirations visible. Goals like earning more, becoming more capable, or gaining stability may not sound radical, but they are meaningful within many Chinese women's lived realities. In that sense, LLMs can surface the everyday practical side of empowerment that matters to many Chinese women. But that resonance also creates risk to everyday feminism on Chinese social media. Because DeepSeek's advice often individualized responsibility, it could shift attention away from structural inequality and back onto women's self-adjustment and self-doubt, which may reduce emotions like anger or refusal. And once that advice gains authority, it may also reduce disagreement and negotiation, which are actually central to the vitality of everyday feminism. Through this case, we argue that LLMs for everyday feminism should be designed for exploration and exchange rather than advice. At the individual level, LLMs should move away from generic, universal guidance. Women's aspirations and pathways vary across sociocultural contexts, so these systems should support women in reflecting on and defining their own goals and possibilities. At the collective level, LLMs should play a more active role in supporting interaction within digital feminist spaces, rather than simply inserting ready-made answers. They should also avoid overly agreeable interaction styles, and instead be designed carefully to invite disagreement and critique, so that digital feminist spaces can remain reflective, negotiated, and plural. Thanks for watching. Please refer to our paper for more details.